I think that was so helpful. Thank you, Lisa. If we could do that every year, that would be very good. So today we're going to be looking at humility and what the Bible says about humility. And before I do dive into the Bible, I just need to give a disclaimer. This isn't me having achieved humility. I'm very much still on the journey. I don't have hundreds of stories of where I've done well at achieving humility. Actually, quite the opposite. I seem to have got a list through my preparation of times when I have not been acting quite so humble. And realizing my limitations, I thought I need a bit of help with this preach. And many of you will have seen or maybe even used ChatGPT, which is an AI chatbot. So for those of you that haven't heard about it, that don't know about it, it's a bit like Google, but it thinks for itself and it's quite clever. It's famous for passing a business degree in America. It can write essays in an instant. And I was a few days out of KCC preach practice and wondering, where is this going? And then it struck me. If it can pass a business degree, if it can pass essays and essay writing, can it pass KCC preach practice? So I eagerly typed in, write a preach on humility for me. And it was quite good. It came back with this definition of being humble. The key to being humble is to have a mindset of humility, which includes being open to learning, being aware of one's own limitations, not constantly seeking validation or recognition. Additionally, treating others with respect and kindness can also contribute to a humble attitude. I thought, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. And within seconds, it had generated an introduction, 3 points, of course. Each point had a Bible verse. It had explained the Bible verse and referenced it correctly. And it had put in a conclusion for me. Score. I was so happy. I had saved myself hours of preparation. Not just hours of preparation for this preach, but for every single preach I may ever do in my life. It saved me so much time. But then as I read it, I realized that maybe it wasn't quite as good as I'd first thought. It had missed Jesus. It didn't mention Jesus once. It didn't mention Jesus, the one who demonstrates perfect humility to us. It didn't reference him. It's not really surprising that a computer without a soul would talk about a spiritual principle without a God, is it? But it did. And I thought, well, better get back to my preach prep. But before I did, and for those of you that are just as concerned as I was about the intelligence of this computer, I asked it, how long will it be till you take over the world? Its response was, I do not have the ability or desire to take over the world. And I thought, that's pretty good. But just to check that it was sure about this, I said, are you sure? And it replied with a slightly less convincing answer of, as a machine, I do not have the ability to be sure or not sure about anything. Oh dear. Now, realizing I'd been a little bit distracted from my preach prep and also sensing sort of fear coming up and dwelling up within me, I thought, well, I'll open the Bible. And I opened it to James 4, which is the passage we're going to be talking on today. And over the last few weeks, we've been hearing about James. We've been learning about our ears and how we need to listen. We've been learning about our hands and how we need to serve. And we've been learning about our mouth and how we should be talking. And today and next week, we're going to be learning about our hearts and how our heart attitude should be. So if we can have the scripture reading, James 4.
What is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires that war within you? You want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, so you fight and wage war to take it away from them. Yet you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You only want what will give you pleasure. You adulterers, don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? I say it again, if you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. Do you think the scriptures have no meaning? They say that God is passionate, that the Spirit he has placed within us should be faithful to him, and he gives grace generously. As the scriptures say, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humble yourselves before God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Come close to God and God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. Let there be tears for what you have done. Let there be sorrow and deep grief. Let there be sadness instead of laughter and gloom instead of joy. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up in honour. Don't speak evil against each other, dear brothers and sisters. If you criticise and judge each other, then you are criticising and judging God's law. But your job is to obey the law, not to judge whether it applies to you. God alone, who gave the law, is the judge. He alone has the power to save or to destroy. So what right do you have to judge your neighbour? Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow we are going to a certain town and will stay there a year. We will do business there and make a profit. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while, then it's gone. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise you are boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil. Remember, it is sin to know what you ought to do and then not do it.
So, I want us to focus in on 3 of those verses today, verses 6 to 8. It says, and he gives grace generously. As the scriptures say, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humble yourselves before God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God, and God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. And the temptation when we read through James is to come away with a list of things that we feel like we need to do. Oh, we need to speak like this. We need to behave like that. We need to talk in this way or that way. But actually what James is talking about is grace. Grace, a gift that's freely given, something that we don't earn, something that we don't deserve, something that isn't done by our own achievements, but something that God gives us freely. And it can actually be translated, where it says, and he gives grace generously, it can actually be translated, and he gives greater grace. See, there's an initial saving grace for everyone who believes, but then there's a further grace, the way in which God allows us to live our lives as he intended, to live our lives to the full. There's this further grace that we can step into, that we can lean into, and that is what transforms our world. It's the secret ingredient, if you like. It's like Coca-Cola have this secret ingredients, and they don't, not many people know it. A few people know exactly which ingredients it is and how much of each ingredient goes into Coca-Cola. They keep them locked up in a vault in Atlanta, and only a couple of people have access to it. And this greater grace is like the secret ingredient of Christian life. Without it, we can't live our lives to the full. Jesus says, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. The Christians that James is writing to here in James 4 quite simply were failing at this. They were saying they were Christians, but their lives weren't transformed. Their lives hadn't been transformed. It says in verse 8 that they were living, their loyalty is divided between God and the world. It's as if they're running a sprint race and they'd shot out the blocks, but they hadn't yet looked up to see where they were going and started running in one direction. Yeah, they'd started the race, they were in the race still, but they weren't living to their full potential. They weren't living out what God had intended for them. And the danger for us is that we do exactly the same. See, life can be so comfortable, can't it? We have everything just at the click of a button. Who needs God when you've got a click, everything at the click of a button? Our life can get so distracted, can't it? We have our things in our pockets or on our wrists that buzz to notify us of 1,000 different things that interrupt our day. It takes our gaze off where we're going and distracts us. It's a real danger for us. And I believe this is the one thing that can make one of the biggest differences into our Christian walk, receiving this greater grace. But how does it say we get it? How can we live a life that's completely transformed by God? Well, let's read those verses again, and I'm just going to tweak the translation to have greater grace in there. It says, and he gives greater grace, as the scriptures say. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humble yourselves before God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. If we want greater grace, if we want to live our lives out transformed by God, we have to push in and lean into humility. I've got 3 points. The first is pride, the second is humility, and the third is it changes absolutely everything. So, first of all, he opposes the proud. This isn't just he doesn't like the proud. This isn't that he tolerates the proud. This is he actually opposes the proud. He's actually against the proud. He sees the proud and he is in opposition to it. John Stott says that pride is the essence of all sin. At its core, it's putting yourself against God. It's putting yourself above God. It's saying, God, I'm not going to live for you. I'm going to live for my agenda and my way instead. It was the devil's first sin, choosing to put himself before God. In verse 7, it says, resist the devil, resist pride. When God actively opposes the proud, he's actually against those who have first opposed him. We have a choice. Are we going to live intentionally for God, or are we going to live for ourselves? You might be a Christian here today. It's still a struggle. You might not be a Christian here today. What are you living your life for? Are you living it for yourselves? Or is there something greater? Jesus' friends give us a great example of this. In Mark 10, there's James and John. They're two brothers, and it's a different James that's written the book that we're reading in the Bible. They're friends with Jesus. And they go up to Jesus and they say, Jesus, can we ask you a favor? And Jesus says, well, yeah, of course you can. Of course you can ask me a favor. And they say, Jesus, when you sit on your glorious throne as king, we want to sit in the places of honor next to you. One on your right, one on your left. Jesus says to them, you don't know what you're asking. In other words, you're crazy. Are you able to take the suffering that I'm going to take, says Jesus. And they reply, oh yes, we can take the suffering that you're going to take, Jesus. I mean, I don't know what they're thinking. I mean, they just completely missed the point. They thought they were as good as Jesus. They could bear what Jesus is going to take. But how similar that is to us. Often we'll put ourselves first. We think that we deserve a place of importance, that our voice deserves an extra say. I find myself thinking that all the time. Maybe that sits with you as well. Maybe we try to manipulate a situation or control someone else because we want to get our agenda through and we think that that's the right way. Maybe we try and buddy up with someone that's a little bit more important so that we can get a promotion. Every time that we're thinking, God, we're thinking I'm more important or I know best, we're really asking the same question. Jesus, can I sit next to you in the place of honor, they said. And Jesus responds with the same answer. You don't know what you're asking. You don't know what you're doing. James and John asked that, but we put ourselves above people all the time, don't we? Maybe because of our social situation. Maybe because of where we live. Maybe because of our background. Maybe because of our finances, our health. Maybe because of what we look like, what we wear. We put ourselves above others all the time in our minds, even if we try and suppress it and keep it in. That's James and John. The other 10 disciples, then, the Bible says that they get indignant. Can you believe that James and John would dare ask Jesus that? Can you believe that James and John think that they're better than us? They start to get cross. They get angry. They've got just as warped a view of themselves as James and John, really, if not more so. At least James and John had confidence in their relationship with Jesus. It was completely misplaced, but at least they had confidence in their relationship with Jesus to ask him for something. These 10 are just getting cross about it. And we do the same, don't we? We do the same when we think that we should have been involved, when our voice should have been heard. Quite simply, competition has entered the camp, and it's not in a good way. Now, I'm quite competitive, and I think that's a real strength. I just need to say that at the beginning. But it can, when it gets to games and things, I can get a little bit too competitive, a little bit too focused, and basically, I'll be ruthless. I don't care how I win, I just have to win. And even in the very hypothetical situation, if I'm playing a game of snakes and ladders with my 4-year-old niece, I have to win. I have to win. It teaches her how to lose. Anyway, competition has got into the camp, and Jesus has to step in and correct it, and he gathers them round, and I imagine he gathers them in a circle, and they've got their arms and their shoulders in like a little huddle, and he's saying, guys, what are you doing? What are you doing? How can you be acting like this? Do you not know that those in the world, they try and get one up on each other? Those who are in authority, they lord it over those under them. And then in Mark 10, verses 43 to 45, it says, but among you, it is going to be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be a servant. Whoever wants to be first must be a slave of everyone. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many. As the church, it has to be different amongst us. It has to be. We have to look different. Point 2 is humility. C.J. Mahaney says that humility for us as sinful humans is assessing ourselves in light of God's holiness and our sinfulness. It's assessing ourselves in light of God's holiness and our sinfulness. See, humility, it's not just saying the right things. It's not just being nice about someone else. It's not just being self-deprecating. It's not even just letting someone through the door in front of you. It can look like those things, but it's not those things. Humility is a heart attitude. It's easy to present as humble, isn't it? But it's not always to be humble. It's easy to be humble inside. Just as I was writing this and preparing this, I noticed a few just times in my own life where I probably wasn't being as humble as I appeared. Firstly, I was having a conversation with someone, and I noticed myself getting overcritical in the way that I was thinking, and it wasn't a right or wrong decision. It was fairly simple. It's down to what preference, really. And I felt outside I was calm, I was humble, I was friendly, but inside I just felt this pride. Basically, I'm right. I know better. What are you even thinking about? Another time, one of my friends asked me how I was doing in a particular area, and I said, oh yeah, I'm fine. I'm good. I gave the impression of everything being good. But really, I wasn't humble enough to be vulnerable. I wasn't humble enough to say, oh, well, I'm actually struggling with this element of life. Another time, someone else gave me feedback, and I thought, well, instead of just accepting it and taking it on board, I didn't even try and appear humble this time. I just disagreed. I just argued back. I didn't take it on board. It's so easy to be proud and not live in a humble way, but God opposes the proud and he gives grace to the humble. So we have to intentionally look to being humble. Just a few chapters after Mark 10, we then see the greatest demonstration of humility that I think is in the Bible. We see Jesus in Mark 14 in a garden on his knees crying. And he's crying because he knows that he's on the path to the cross. He knows he's going to be killed. He knows that pain and suffering is coming his way. And he doesn't want that. And he's praying, Lord, I don't want this, but if you want me to, I will. He says, Father, everything is possible with you. Take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet I want your will to be done and not mine. That's Mark 14:36. I want your will to be done and not mine. He's saying, God, I know it's going to be painful. I know physically it's going to be the worst pain I could possibly go through. Emotionally, it's going to be terrible. Spiritually, it's going to be just completely outrageous because he's taking on board the punishment of the sins of all those who believe in him. And he doesn't deserve a single bit of it. And we go on to see him, don't we? We go on to see him arrested. He's put on trial. He's mocked. He's spat on. He's whipped. He's stripped naked. He's marched in front of crowds of people. He has nails put through his feet and through his wrists. Humiliated in front of his friends, in front of his family, in front of everyone who would have walked in and out of Jerusalem that day on that road. Humiliated, not thinking of himself, laying his life down as a ransom for many, paying the price for the freedom of millions and millions of people. In James, it says we can overcome pride in two ways. Verse 7, it says resist sin. Verse 8, it says come close to God. And in a minute, we're going to take communion. And we're going to respond and we're going to remember Jesus on that cross. But really, the way that we can get this into us is by putting things in place that will help us throughout the week. Remembering Jesus once a week on a Sunday morning is not going to do us, it's going to be great, but it's not going to be as good as if we can remember him every day. What would it look like if our weeks, every single day we were in the Bible, we were praying? This week I heard of one guy who has set a reminder on his phone just for 3 points throughout the day to remind him to pray. Morning, lunchtime, evening. Maybe a 10-second prayer, maybe a few-minute prayer. But he set it so he can fix his eyes back on Jesus. Do we prioritize church, prayer meetings, connect groups, times when we can come together, sharpen each other, and also look to Jesus? Do we practice serving in your job? Are you serving those around you? Or are you working for yourself? In your families, are we serving? In church, are we serving? Just this week, I heard of 5 Sunday teams that are struggling for people. And we're having to decide, are we going to run groups the same? Are we going to run things the same? If you're not serving, can I just encourage you, join a team? You can do that through going to the website or go to the reception desk afterwards. How are you doing pursuing humility? How are we doing pursuing Jesus? It changes absolutely everything. We go on to read in Acts 12 of James. What happened to James? Well, in Acts 12, it says that he's again in front of a different king. He's not in front of Jesus this time. He's in front of King Herod. And this time, he's not asking for a place of honor. He's not asking to sit on his right or on his left side. Instead, he's on his knees. It says he's beheaded with the sword, laying down his life for his beliefs, for the church. Completely changed. John, what do we read about John? Well, John writes the last book of the Bible, Revelation. And he doesn't write it from a place where he's earned himself honor and fame. John's writing from a place of humiliation, from the island of Patmos. He's been exiled. He's been kicked out of society. He's far away from his friends, his family, his church. And he's writing to them and he's saying, don't forget Jesus. He's not asking for a leg up. He's not saying, remember me, I'm far away, but please remember me. He's not saying that. He's saying, remember Jesus, live for Jesus, be more radical for him, resist sin. But what's the difference? James and John asking for a place of honor. At this point, they had spent years with Jesus already. They had seen Jesus do miracles. They had seen him feed the 5,000. They had seen him heal people. But something has changed. Something completely has changed them completely. It's that they've seen Jesus lay his life down as a ransom for many on the cross. You can't help but be changed. You can't help but be humbled when you come to the cross. It's how we assess ourselves in the light of God's holiness and our sinfulness. It's the one thing that the AI missed. It's the most important thing about humility. We cannot miss it too. John Stott says this: every time we look at the cross, Christ seems to be saying to us, I am here because of you. It's your sin that I'm bearing, your curse that I'm suffering, your debt that I'm paying, and your death that I'm dying. Nothing in history or in the universe cuts us down to size like the cross. All of us have inflated views of ourselves, especially in self-righteousness, until we have visited a place called Calvary. It is there, at the foot of the cross, that we shrink down to our true size. Let's decide that amongst us it has to be different. Let's decide that we want his will and not our will. We're going to sing now. And I'm sure, I know it will for me, but I'm sure there's many people here where it needs to just start off with us looking to Jesus and repenting. God, I'm so sorry for where I've put myself on top, where I've thought of myself as better than others. But then let's come to Jesus. Let's come to him and praise him and thank him and assess ourselves in the light of his holiness.